This is July, we're slating this tape number 9. It's July 31st, 2003. We're at Timeless Voices. I'm Nick Nabel. I'll be doing the interviewing. Dave Marks is the cameraman. Brian Marks is our assistant. And our guest this morning is George Purifoy. And George, would you please give us your name and spell it for us?
My name is George Purifoy. It's spelled P as in Peter, U-R-I-F as in Frank, O-Y.
Okay. George, when were you born and where?
I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, February 15th, 1929.
What did your parents do?
My dad was an electrical engineer for Westinghouse. My mother was a housewife.
Tell me a little bit about your early childhood and when you first became interested in airplanes.
Well, earliest memories are of interest in airplanes. I built models from the time my folks would let me hold a sharp knife, and still do today. I guess my father took me on my first airplane ride. He was not a pilot, but he took me out to the Allegheny County Airport in Pittsburgh, outside of Pittsburgh, and I remember that first ride in a Ford Trimotor. I don't remember the date, but it was probably in the early 30s sometime.
You say you remember that date. Tell us a little bit about that day and what went through your mind.
Well, it was for a young man interested in flying machines. It was pretty exciting, although it was a bigger airplane than I was really interested in, I thought. But I was impressed by the size of the interior and the wicker seats and the curtains on the windows and the flight I don't remember a lot about, except looking out the window at the city of Pittsburgh and the Three Rivers confluence that forms Pittsburgh. The flight, once we were airborne, disappointed me a little bit because the airplane flew straight and level most of the time, and maybe I was showing some fighter pilot interests even back then, because I was disappointed that he didn't do something with the airplane.
What was the next time that you were able to get into an airplane and go for a ride or get behind the stick?
I guess when I was 12 or 14, some place in there, I had indicated to my parents that I intended to be a Navy pilot, and that I wanted to learn as much about that kind of thing as I could prior to being old enough to start the process. I talked them into buying for me a couple of lessons in an Aeronca Champ at a local airport in Monroeville, a dirt runway, a man owned by a man that later I flew for. When I'd come home on leave, I'd go out to that airport and he'd have me take students up in that same Champ, as a matter of fact. But that was the first direct control of an airplane that I had a chance to do.
When did you decide that you wanted to take lessons, and how did that all happen?
Well, I knew I wanted to learn to fly as early as possible, and I knew, I couldn't solo until I was 16, but I started to take lessons. We didn't have a lot of money in those days, and so my lessons were few and far between. They were mainly familiarization. I knew as I approached high school graduation that the best way for me to A, get some college, and B, learn to fly would be to join or at least apply for a Navy V5 program, which I did. Took the examinations and was accepted. And in those days, the program was that you had to get yourself into college in an engineering school, but then the Navy would pay for the first 2 years of your college. After those 2 years, then you went to Pensacola and started flight training. And after the period of time, which seemed to change frequently, you then had fulfilled your commitment, and presumably by that time you were rated and flying operationally. Then you could get out, and the Navy would buy you the next 2 years of college, and that to me sounded like a good deal, and so I pursued it.
Talk about those airplanes as you got into them and mastered them and went on to the next steps.
Well, this is part of, I think, the few uniquenesses that maybe I represent, in that I'm, I think, one of the very few people who have been essentially all the way through both Naval and Air Force pilot training. And the story was that after 2 years of college at Lafayette College, I went to Pensacola, became an aviation midshipman, which was the same as an Annapolis midshipman. There are no aviation midshipmen anymore, but that's what we were in those days. Went through 17 weeks of pre-flight at Mainside, Pensacola, and went to Whiting Field, which is north of Pensacola, up in Florida, and started to fly, to be trained in the SNJ or T6. My first instructor was a chief, a Navy chief, not a commissioned officer. And there were still some flying chiefs in those days, and Chief Mearshite was the guy that taught me to fly. So I went through that program and got through instrument training and all that kind of thing. We actually flew gunnery in the SNJ, had a little .30 caliber gun in the nose of the airplane. Don't see that these days anymore either. I then had an opportunity to join an experimental group. The Navy was experimenting with training programs that would permit student pilots to transition to operational fighter type aircraft early. And so I got a chance to fly the F4U Corsair, big husky 2200 horsepower airplane, beautiful airplane. I only had I only had 8 hours in the F4U, when I got a telegram from home, actually from a family doctor at home in Pittsburgh, saying that both my parents were critically ill and could I come home and take care of the situation. So I got an emergency leave and went home, and it became apparent that I simply had to somehow stay home and take care of them. I have a sister, but she was married to a Navy pilot, and they were in Hawaii, and she could not come back. And I was here was a kid, 19 years old, flying F4Us, and I had to resign. I was about, I would guess, 2/3 of the way through the full naval flight training program. I went back to Pittsburgh and took care of my folks. Ultimately, my father died, and later my mother did. I went back to college at the University of Pittsburgh. I could live at home and go to school and take care of the folks. Got my degree, an engineering degree from Pitt. After I'd been home about 2 years, and during that time, I got my private license. The FAA essentially gave it to me. I had plenty of hours, and so there wasn't any problem there. And I actually got my instructor's ticket, and I was instructing and flying as many different kinds of airplanes as I could get my hands on at the local airports. I was surprised then one morning to get a notice from my draft board saying that I should report for a pre-induction physical. I said, no, I've already been in there. And they said, well, that doesn't count because you were never commissioned, which was true. I was a first-class midshipman when I resigned. So I did not have, I never did have an ensign's commission. And so I went back to the Navy. In fact, I took a train to Washington and went to the bureau in Washington and buttonholed everybody I could get my hands on, saying, look, I'm essentially a trained naval aviator. Can I come back in and fly? And they said, oh boy, we need pilots and we'd be delighted to have you back in, but we don't have a pigeonhole that you fit in. You know, here you almost completed the program, and you got out and you've been flying civilian airplanes for a couple of years, and we'd love to have you, but you've got to come in and start all over again, go all the way through the Naval Flight Training Program again. And at that time, the program was, I believe, 18 months in length. And you couldn't be married then. And by that time, I had met the lady that I wanted to be my wife, and 18 months seemed like an awful long time to wait for marriage. So I went to the Air Force. And I told them my story, and they said essentially the same thing. We'd be delighted to have you in. We need pilots, but you'd have to start over and go all the way through the aviation cadet program in the Air Force. While I was debating about these options, I got the telegram that said, greetings, report to the train station 0600 Saturday morning. Uncle Sam wants you in the Army. And so I called up the Air Force recruiter and I said, hey, I've got this telegram from the draft board. And he said, get your fanny down here. I walked in the door of the recruiting office and he said, raise your right hand. And they swore me in. They said, now we got you in the Air Force, the Army can't get you, but we don't know what we're going to do with you because we don't have a cadet class for you yet. So they made me a PFC. They decided that the military training I'd had qualified me for PFC. They made me a PFC in the Air Force, sent me out to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and for 4 months I drove a mail truck and installed telephones until a cadet class opened up. And I was sent to Marana Air Base, a brand new Air Force training base outside of Tucson, Arizona. We were the first class, Class 52G, at Marana. And so I became an cadet and went through the complete program. Some interesting things occurred. I decided not to tell people in the program at Marana that I had several hundred hours of flying time and had been in the Navy program. So I went through pre-flight and got my instructor for the introductory flight. We got in the airplane, and of course the instructor was in the back. This was a T-6, and of course I had been flying SNJs in the Navy, which is the same airplane, it's just we didn't have a tail hook in the Air Force. Mr. Samuels, Sammy, was my instructor, who was I believe, Cherokee Indian. He was an Indian anyway, and I think of the Cherokee tribe. And he had actually flown Spitz in the Eagle Squadron in Battle of Britain. That man could fly like nobody I have ever been with. He was really good. Sammy got in the back in the first ride, and I was debating about whether to tell him I knew how to fly, and I decided I wouldn't. Of course, I didn't know him. I just met him that day. So I decided I would fly with my left hand, because I would be awkward flying left-handed, until I got to know the instructor and what he wanted and that kind of thing. So we took off, and he demonstrated the takeoff, and we flew around. He said, all right, now you take the airplane. So I took it with my left hand, and he had me make a couple of gentle turns one way and the other, in which I did uncoordinatedly. And he said, okay, I got the airplane. He said, tell you what, why don't you put your right hand on your right ear? Well, I had never had an instructor tell me that before. My right hand on my right ear. He said, now put your left hand on your left ear. So we did that, and he said, all right, now pull your head out of your ass. You can fly. Tell me about it. So I told Sammy what experiences I had. He said, okay, well, we're going to have a ball. He said, I don't have to teach you stalls and spins and all the stuff that the primary students get. He said, we're going to do some other things. And that man probably saved my life, because he made me the fighter pilot I was, and I think I was pretty good. As I say, he could fly, and his experiences were just priceless. And so while other kids were doing stalls and shooting landings, Sammy and I were off, and he was showing me all kind of advanced aerobatics and that kind of stuff. Went through basic training at Marana.
Let's go back to Sammy for just a second.
Oh, okay.
Can you give me any kind of anecdote of a particular day with Sammy that stands out in your memory?
Well, that one about putting my hands on my ears was
Right.
Give
me another one.
He said one day, you'll know you're able to fly a T-6 if you can loop it from straight and level flight. I said, yeah, it won't loop from straight and level flight. You can set cruise power. You simply have to drop the nose and pick up some more knots before you can pull it up and over. Oh, he said, let me show you. Set cruise power, and he had the touch to get that airplane to come up, and of course it was sloppy. The airplane was mushing across the top and literally falling out of the loop. But you could do it. If you pulled a little too hard, it would snap. He said, now that's the key. You practice till you can do that. And I did. It was a real challenge. But I always remembered that. You can do things with an airplane that the slide rule says you can't do. But there's just some magic about a good pilot and a responsive airplane that makes all the difference.
So after your training with the T6, what came next?
Then I was sent up to the fighter school at Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix, actually in Chandler outside of Phoenix, for jet training. We started out flying T6s up there, doing advanced things, mainly instruments, that kind of stuff, and then transitioned to the jet. They gave us 3 rides in a T-33, a 2-place jet airplane, and then they strapped us into an old tired F-80, the old Shooting Star fighter, and said, "Okay, kid, go fly it." and that was a real thrill, because that was the first operational fighter that I had flown in the Air Force, and the first operational fighter jet that I had flown in the Air Force. And those were old airplanes. A lot of them had seen duty in Korea, but they were a marvelous airplane, and I was small in those days. I weighed about 129 pounds soaking wet. And it had a little tiny cockpit, but it fit me just fine. And it was a very responsive airplane. But it had some quirks. For example, it did not have nose wheel steering. And you could get out on the runway and turn it too sharply and get a cocked nose wheel from which you couldn't recover. They would have to come out and straighten the nose gear before you could taxi. And of course, that was the kiss of death. You really got criticized pretty badly for that kind of thing. So we tried hard not to get hung up. The airplanes were, as I say, underpowered. We had the can't remember the designation of the engine, but it was not an actual flow jet. It was a centrifugal flow engine, and quite low power. And in the summertime in Phoenix, those runways were 120, 130 degrees, and of course the jet engine loses power as the temperature goes up, and the air gets less dense. And I can remember many a time coming off the runway. I think we had 8,000 feet, and I can recall starting takeoff runs back on the overrun and having literally to suck the gear out from under the thing as we hit the end of the runway to get it in the air. And then you'd blow dust out across the desert for miles before you could get the thing to climb. But once you got to altitude, it was a marvelous airplane. Perhaps an anecdote for my grandchildren that they almost lost their granddaddy. I did the classic stupid cadet trick. you get in a fighter airplane for the first time or one of the first times, and you think you're the hottest rock on the planet, and you can do anything with that airplane. I climbed up one day, of course, this single-seat airplane, and I wasn't very high, only maybe 8,000 or 9,000 feet. At cruise speed, which with the F-80 was 380 knots or thereabouts, and I said, I wonder what this airplane would do in a split S. And without thinking, just pure dumb stupidity, I just rolled the airplane over and pulled from 8,000 feet. And boy, that desert came up in a rush. I completed the split S, but I over-G'd the airplane and literally came out blowing dust on the bottom, just pulling for all I was worth to try to get the airplane to come around. When I came back in and landed, the crew chief took one look and called the flight commander over to look at the airplane. It was leaking fuel, and it had popped rivets along all on one side. He said, "What's your G meter read?" And it had a recording G meter, and I think the G limit on that airplane was 7.33, and I had pulled about 9 with it, and I got a pretty good chewing for that one. So flew P-80s and completed Air Force pilot training at Williams Air Force Base. Graduated at Williams. I didn't have folks to come out to my graduation, and my fiance was working and couldn't come. And I was still in touch, corresponding with my old instructor, my first instructor, Sammy, who was still instructing down at Marana. And I got a phone call from Sammy saying, Betty was his wife, Betty and I are coming up for your graduation, which they did, and Betty pinned my wings on. Made me feel good. Then I had leave after graduation, and of course I was commissioned at that point. I became a second lieutenant. Went on leave home, married my sweetheart, and then we came back to Phoenix because my next assignment was gunnery school at Luke Air Force Base outside of Phoenix. At Luke, we transitioned to the F-84, the Thunderjet, straight wing airplane. Bigger than the F-80, heavier, more power, could carry more load, greater range. Kind of a neat airplane. I had really hoped to get F-86s, Sabre jets. I got a chance later on, after I got back from Korea, to fly a Sabre jet a little bit. Nice airplane. And at the time I went to gunnery school, I really thought, the hot rocks of the Korean War were the Sabre pilots. I really wanted to do that. And I was at one of the top 10% of my class, and I thought I really rated F-86s, so I went to see the commandant.
Okay, hold that thought. We gotta change tapes. Okay. We'll get into that, and then we'll come out.
Fresh tape here for you. Okay. Use tape.
Okay, we're off and rolling.
Okay, we're slating tape number 10. It is July 31st, 2003. Camera operator is Dave Marks. I'm Nick Nabel, the interviewer. Brian Marks is the assistant. And we rejoin George Purifoy, who's talking to us about his He has just gone to Luke, where he's worked with the F-84s.
Came back from leave and with a new bride. We got a little house in Phoenix and reported to Luke. Went to ground school on the F-84 Thunderjet. And then we started right in a couple of introductory rides. We flew constantly in flights of 4 from that point on, because that was the operational excuse me, method of fighter flying in those days, and still is. The 4-ship flight is the key. 2 elements. We on the very first ride with the 84, we had been briefed strongly that watch your airspeed, because the 84 has a critical Mach, 0.82 Mach, and the controls freeze on that airplane. And the only way you get any control is to slow down. But if you get too far through the Mach, the only way to slow down is, if your nose is down, is to drop your speed brake. And that causes a violent pitch up. So you're between a rock and a hard place. You can pitch up and pull too many G's, or you can go too fast, out of control. We then, on the very first ride, went up, and the instructor said, okay, now, one of the things we want to do right off the bat is show you what that Mach lockup of the controls feels like. So what we're going to do is go out and spread formation, line abreast, about 100 yards apart, 4 airplanes. So we'll just drop the nose, you stay with me, and there were 3 students and an instructor, and we'll just gradually increase speed. When you feel it buffet and feel the stiffness come on the controls, then pull off power and just gradually ease out. So we did that, dropped the nose. The number 4 student in the flight went all the way in. Very first flight in the 84, and we lost a student. He simply panicked, we think, and didn't ease the airplane out, and it got deep enough into the Mach regime, probably around 8.6, 8.7 somewhere, and the airplane just completely went out of control, and he went all the way into the desert. And that was pretty sobering, first ride. Turned out that the time I was at Luke, we had a lot of foreign students, French, Belgiques, Norwegians, some of them flying P-51s and some flying 84s. During the time I was at the school, and I can't remember how long that was, but a number of months, we averaged 1 fatality a day. That was pretty tough on my new bride, who was in this little house we had in Phoenix, wondering if the knock on the door was somebody in a blue suit to come tell her that her husband had bought the farm. That was sobering, to lose that many. And there were so many ways. We were doing all kinds of ground support gunnery. I mentioned earlier that I really wanted to fly 86s, and when I talked to people who had been to Korea and in combat, they said, you know, most F-86 pilots go over there, fly their 100 missions, never fire their guns. They said, you're going to do ground support, you're going to fire your guns every mission. no problem. And that made me feel better. At least I figured I'd be doing something. So we did all kinds of ground support ordnance, low angle bombing, high angle bombing, rocketry, strafing, napalm, the whole gamut of things. A fully loaded F-84 could carry two 1,000-pound bombs on two pylons, 8 5-inch HVAR rockets, 4 under each wing, and 6 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 1 in each wing. And we had the capability of mid-air refueling, except that we didn't have any tankers in Korea, so we didn't do any mid-air refueling till I got back stateside. So we practiced all of these things on the range at Yuma, at Gila Bend. The Air Force has a gunnery range out there with trucks and tanks and stuff to shoot at. In addition to the air-to-ground work, we also got a chance to practice air-to-air work. They'd send an 84 up towing a sleeve, a banner, and we would make air-to-air passes on it. Of course, everybody got a chance to fly the tow plane, and that was a little sobering because, you know, you could look back and watch the fighters come in and just hope they're not leading that banner too much. You know, you could lose your tail. But it was good experience and served us well in Korea because even right at the end of the war, which was the time that I got over there, we were still being bounced by MiGs. And there was a real opportunity to at least have to dodge. You couldn't dogfight with a MiG. The 84 just not that capable an airplane. The thing, if you really got in trouble, the only thing you could do is jettison your load and put the nose down. You could outrun them going down, even though it was a supersonic. The MiG was a supersonic airplane. They didn't like to fly it out in those speed ranges. So went through gunnery school, and that was really the first time that I got the satisfaction of knowing I was flying an honest to goodness weapon, and that I could use it. After gunnery school, my wife and I drove to California, and I dropped her off in Santa Barbara, where she stayed while I was in Korea, and got on an airplane and headed overseas. This was a civilian flight, but a military airplane. We had canvas seats. It's interesting that the plane was full of second lieutenant fighter pilots going to Korea, and we sat around on the floor. Of course, there were no plush seats. We had just canvas seats on the side, so it was easier just to sit on the floor and play cards or whatever. I recall going into Tokyo, we hit had to go through a front, hit some pretty good turbulence. And this was a DC-6 airplane. We got bounced around pretty good, and after a while, all of us were feeling a little uneasy, even though we were supposed to be tough fighter pilots. You know, we were getting airsick. So I went up front. Because there was no door to the cockpit. I could just go stand and talk to the pilots. And I said, you know, you got an airplane full of pretty woozy fighter pilots. Any chance that you'll let us fly a little bit? That's the best cure I know for air sickness. Sure, he said. So he got out of the seat and let me sit down, fly for 5-10 minutes and feel a lot better. Even though you were just holding the airplane, but at least you were doing something. Anyway, we got on the ground without incident. From Tokyo, Tachikawa Air Base, I lucked out. It turned out that my childhood buddy, the guy that I had grown up with in my neighborhood, had been in the pilot class ahead of me, and had gone over to Japan after he got his wings. And he flew transports, and he was flying C-46s out of Tachikawa. And Dick met me. Dick Valentine is his name. Dick met me and arranged that I would be on one of his flights going to Korea, to K2 Air Base, which was at Daegu, Korea. So Dick flew me over, and I was really fortunate to have him in Japan while I was in Korea, because as we got settled in, if I needed something that I couldn't get in Korea, which was almost anything you could name, Dick could get it, and he was flying regular shuttles over from Tachikawa, and so he'd bring me stuff. Turned out that we were building a squadron bar in our little barracks, and we needed a Coke cooler. I called Dick up on the landline and said, "You get a Coke cooler?" "Oh yeah," he said, "I'd probably find one someplace." I said, well, tell me when you're coming in. This was before I had started flying combat. There was a introductory period where we had to learn the area, and we had to go to survival school and a whole bunch of stuff before we could actually fly combat. And the phone rang, and it was Dick, and he said, "I got your Coke cooler. Got an ETA of, I've forgotten now, 11:15 or whatever it was." And I said, "Well, I'll see if I can get a flight scheduled to meet you." And sure enough, the 484s met the C-46. 484s from the 310th Fighter Bomber Squadron, which was my squadron. 58th Group, 58th Fighter Group, 310th Squadron. We had 3 squadrons in the group, the 310th, the 311th, and the 69th. All different color tails. The 310th was yellow tails, and the 11th was red, and the 69th was blue. So we had 4 yellowtail 84s meet this C-46. We got in tight formation, 2 on each wing, escorted him in, actually did a fighter pitch out with a C-46, landed, taxied up, and I landed, put my airplane in a revetment and borrowed the squadron commander's Jeep and drove across the field to where Dick was parked. Got over there, Dick opened the door and started handing down this Coke cooler, and the base commander, Colonel Nylander, drove up. He said, "Lieutenant, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, sir, we've got a delivery, a Coke cooler." "Oh," he said, "you're building a squadron bar, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I'll be over tonight." So we took the Coke cooler back, and we had an ice plant on the base, and we could get ice for our Coke cooler. So it was nice to have Dick over there. And after the war, when I got an R&R, I could go to Japan and meet him and do things together for a few days before going back to Korea. Went through survival school over there, and then of course, everybody is anxious to fly combat because you got to get your 100 missions in before you can go home. The deal was you were either there for a full year, 12 months, or 100 missions, whichever came first. And so all of us who were new well, all of the pilots in the squadron, we had 16 pilots in our squadron. All the pilots in the squadron were pushing to get on the flight schedule for combat missions. And it turned out that the war ended 27 July 1953, and on that day I flew my 25th mission. I wanted more desperately. I enjoyed combat flying. I enjoyed getting shot at, but the adrenaline rush was neat, and the feeling that we really were doing some good. I mean, you could see if you cut that railroad track or knocked down that bridge or bombed the factory or whatever it was our targets were. Anyway, on that last day, we knew that there were talks going on at Panmunjom with an eye toward ending the war, but we didn't know when it was going to end. Turned out we flew a mission. My logbook says we flew a mission to Haeju. I carried 2 1,000-pound bombs. We did a dive bomb run on a bridge factory. On the way home, still north of the bomb line, the GCI site, the radar site that covered the area where we were, called us up and said, "Hey, you guys ought to know the war's over." And we looked down and they were shooting at us. We said, "The hell it is." And actually we got shot at all the way home after the armistice was signed. And that was kind of an unusual feeling. I could just see myself getting shot down after the war ended. With the end of the war, I only had 25 missions, and the 2 other new pilots that had joined the squadron when I did, one had 20 and one had 11. After a few months, of course we still had to stay over there, and we flew alerts. The tension didn't diminish when they signed the armistice. We still had to sit strip alert. We had 4 airplanes armed and ready to go all of the time out at the end of the runway. And we still flew very intensively training missions. We had a gunnery range north of K2 on the Naktong River, and we would go up there and practice all kinds of ordnance delivery. And we did that very rigorously to keep our skills sharp, because we didn't know if the thing was going to crank back up again. But of course we weren't getting credit for those flights. Nobody was shooting at us.
Take us back, if you would, to a day of a typical, you're going from your briefing to one of your bomb runs, and take us through one of those days, one that stands out in your memory.
Okay. We generally, if it was a group raid, and we had 2 groups on the field. We had 6 F-84 squadrons on the base, 2 groups of 3 squadrons each. We didn't often fly with the other group. So generally the frag that would come down, the orders that would come from Tokyo, giving us the targets for the day, would be assigned by group, and then the group would assign the squadrons that were to participate, depending on the ordnance load and the amount of explosive and that kind of thing. Up at 5 o'clock in the morning, it's still dark, struggle into a flight suit, and grab a cup of coffee and go to briefing. You walk in the room and sit down, and there may be 20 other pilots there assigned on this particular target. The group briefing officer, sometimes it was a wing staff officer, major or light colonel, would be up on stage, and he would dramatically throw the drapes open and expose the map of Korea and say, "Gentlemen, the target for today is here," and you'd look at all the flak sites marked around it and say, "Oh geez, we got to go there." and so they'd give a briefing on times and join-ups and rescue. They generally had a ResCap, a flight of fighters that would orbit any downed pilot that was unlucky enough to get hit. So you'd get briefed on the general stuff. And then you go back to the individual squadrons and the we briefed by flights of 4. The flight commander would then brief on how he wanted to conduct his part of the mission, what the join up would be. He might say something like, we're carrying VP fuses, which were proximity fuses. And they were scary things, because one day shortly after I got to the base, I saw a flight take off, and we took off by elements, 2 ships and then 2 ships, and then the element would join on the climb out. This flight took off, and the first element in a left turn, the second element joining on the inside, and just as they joined, I think it was the number 3 airplane, the flight lead for the second element. Evidently, an arming wire had pulled loose from a proximity fuse and armed the fuse. Well, there was all that metal around. There were 4 airplanes right there with an armed proximity fuse, and it went. 1,000-pound bomb. It took all 4. And that was pretty sobering. So often, if we were carrying VPs, the flight lead would brief, "Look, we're going to join up in spread formation until we're sure that everybody's weapon is safe. And wingmen, check your flight leads, and have the flight lead drop back and check yours." You could actually see the arming wires, make sure that the fuses were still safe. And he might brief on the kind of join up he wanted, or it might be weather conditions. And he said, "Okay, now we're going to climb by elements. We won't join up underneath. There isn't room. We'll climb by elements. We should break out at 18,000 and climb on this heading. And after we break out, we'll join up and then set course for the target." So you do that kind of briefing, and then everybody goes out. Start engine time is whatever, and everybody has a hack watch, and so we start engines on time. We could not see the individual airplanes. If I sat in the cockpit of my airplane, I could not see the plane next to me, because there were sandbag revetments for each individual airplane, and they were walls to keep, if a bomb exploded in one revetment, it wouldn't wipe out the whole line, kind of thing. So we started engines on time and generally on a radio call. So it might be carrot mic, start engines, go, and so you fire up. and Carrot might check in, 2, 3, 4. Raj, let's taxi. And taxi out. And of course, we knew what the wind was, what runway. We only had one runway at K2, so it was either take off to the north or take off to the south, depending on the wind. If it was a real hot day, we might be using JADO, and we did that. With a heavy load, we had about 10,000 feet of runway, but if you were really loaded up with fuel and ammo and everything the bird would carry, it took a while to get that thing to fly. And the JADO really came in handy, but you had to watch it, because when you fired the JADO, you gave your wingman a signal, a visual signal to fire JADO, and so you both fired at the same time. And of course, he's sitting right beside you, and you get a nice kick in the pants, and it's tempting to pull the nose up, but that JADO doesn't last very long. You could find yourself nose high, running out of airspeed when the JADO quit. So you had to be careful and hold it down. Generally, you try to slide off to one side of the runway so you didn't have the second element taking off IFR, because the JADO put out a lot of white smoke. It would just simply cloud the runway. So the first flight off, if the wind was off to one side or the other, would slide over to the side toward which the wind was blowing, so that the white smoke would drift off the runway, and the second element could see where they were going. So you take off, climb, join up, finally go to the target. Everybody's looking for MiGs, because we were pretty vulnerable when we were loaded. We could not turn sharply. You just couldn't pull many G's on the airplane. So everybody's looking, and if sometimes you fly along and number 4 would call, "Hey, we got bent wings coming south," and look up, and sure enough, you could see contrails coming, and the question was, were they our 86 cover or were they MiGs? And generally they were MiGs, because always our 86 cover was late. We would wish they were there, and they weren't. And so we'd watch, and if the MiGs came down, then we would, the flight lead would decide what he's going to do. Of course, he'd kick us out into spread formation. You don't stay in tight, because you can't maneuver in tight. You go out to combat spread and watch the airplanes come in, and the MiG pilots didn't impress me very much. I think toward the end of the war, they might have, of course they were using Russian pilots, but they might have been using some student type as well, because many times they simply didn't fly as crisply and as with the precision that I would expect the old veterans to do. I got a shot at one, just one. He came in from behind me and to the right, and I watched him come. And just, you don't want to turn too early, because then he can get inside you and get lead. So you watch, and when you judge he's starting to squeeze, and of course he's got 2 light machine guns and a big mother cannon in that MiG. If he ever hits you with that, the cannon doesn't fire very quickly, only a couple of rounds a minute. But if he ever hits you with it, that's all she wrote. So you judge when you think he's getting within range, and then you brake, roll vertical, you call the brake to your wingman, and you brake into him, into the side that he's coming toward. You turn the airplane just as hard as you can turn it, and the idea is to force him to overshoot you. He can't pull enough G's to get the nose ahead so that he can hit you.
Yeah, G's.
tape here.
Oh, geez, I'm talking and talking.
No, these
No,
are
that's
great. Number 11. It's July 31st, 2003. Dave Marks is the camera person. I'm Nick Nabel. And we rejoined George Purifoy Jr. And George, if you had to tell your great grandchildren, if they get on the internet and drag this down, what would you like to tell them about you, the young man flying this high-powered machine? What went through your mind? What did you feel like on those days as you did this? You said you enjoyed it. Why did you enjoy it?
I have a distinct memory of so many times feeling I was the luckiest kid in the world. Here I was, you know, in my early 20s, doing the thing that I dearly loved to do. And I can remember taking off a number of times and thinking how beautiful the dawn was if we were taking off early. You know, the light on my wingman's airplane. Just how lucky I was. How fortunate. Mostly the feelings flying were like that. There really are times when, you know, there's hours and hours of boredom and moments of stark terror, and that literally happens. But it's those moments of boredom when you can sit back and you're not fighting to hold formation. Those things come automatically, and you do it without thinking, just as you stay in the right-hand lane on a highway with your car. You don't think about the control movements that you're making to stay there, and it was the same flying. You could sit back and admire the piece of machinery that you were in and its responsiveness and the loveliness of the world around you, literally. And simply thinking, you know, there are not very many people of the billions in this world that can do what I'm doing. You know, I'm so bloody lucky to have this experience, and it really was almost a religious experience to do that, particularly on a pretty day. Now, if there was lightning and low clouds and if you were flying wing and you're really working your tail off trying to stay with the flight lead, then the feeling is much different. But on nice, pretty days, it's marvelous.
So the war, take us beyond.
Okay, I ended the last tape. I wanted to describe quickly for my grandchildren the fact that I actually got to hit a MiG. I didn't down it, or I didn't know that I did. The MiG came in from my right stern, and when I felt it was the right time, I broke into him, vertical bank, as many G's on the airplane as, you know, it just shuddered all the way around. And the MiG undershot me, and he went under me. He couldn't pull enough lead to hit me, and went under me. And as he went under me, I rolled the rest of the way around. I had broken to the right. I simply continued that right roll, went on around and then pulled G coming back to the left. And I was able to hit him going away. He was in front of me, and I got a fairly low deflection shot. And I actually got pieces. I have the gun camera film. I got pieces off him, but I didn't get credit for a kill because nobody saw him go down. So I don't know how badly I damaged. But I sure as hell scared him, I'll tell you that. And that was the only MiG I got shot at a number of times with MiGs, but that's the only one I ever got a chance to shoot back at. After the war, I had to stay in Korea because I didn't have my 100 missions. I was there. I became a flight commander of dogflight. When the base got a new wing commander, he was an 84 pilot, but of course he hadn't been in Korea. And evidently, our outgoing colonel, Colonel Nylander, thought enough of me and I was a first lieutenant by then, as a first lieutenant to recommend to the new colonel that I be his instructor in getting oriented to the Korean Peninsula area and to the fighter tactics that we used over there. And so for about a month I flew with this colonel almost exclusively. Another thing that I got a chance to do while I was there was to actually form an aerobatic team. This was after the war, and of course we would go up on training flights. I was a flight commander, and I had 5 other airplanes in my flight, and I would take 3 pilots and myself, and we'd go up and we'd fly diamond, and we'd do rolls and loops and stuff, and we actually put on a couple of shows as an aerobatic team. Now we certainly weren't anything like the Thunderbirds, but we had a good time, and it kept us sharp with the airplane. Finally, it was time to go home. It was hard to find transportation to go home, and most guys went to Tachikawa, to Japan, and then just sort of sat around in the BOQ over there until there was a transport going back. And I decided I didn't want to do that, so I went over to base ops at K2, our air base in Korea, and there was a C-124 came in and offloaded a whole bunch of stuff, and I happened to talk to the pilot, the aircraft commander, and he allowed us how they had an empty airplane. They were going to deadhead back to San Francisco. And I said, you got a whole empty airplane, could I go? And he said, sure, come on. So I had orders to go back, and so I got on the airplane, and after about 10 hours in the air, the aircraft commander, I was sitting up front with them because I was the only other person besides the loadmaster on the airplane and the crew chief. The aircraft commander said, come on, you got to pay your dues, sit down and fly this airplane. So I got about 20 hours of C-124 time flying the thing going home. Met my wife, and we drove back to Pittsburgh, which was our hometown. I had leave, and then I was assigned to Strategic Air Command. I was back in the days when SAC had fighters, and I was assigned to Strategic Air Command in Great Falls, Montana. Great Falls Air Force Base, which is now Malmstrom Air Force Base. Turned out that when I got there, one of the things they did with me was they made me a standboard check pilot, and I flew check rides on all of the squadron pilots. Coincidentally, we went TDY as a group, TDY back to Japan after about 4 months in Montana. When we did that, we left Colonel Malmstrom, who was our base exec. We left him back at Great Falls to take care of the base, and while we went overseas. Turned out that just a week before then, I had flown a standboard ride with Colonel Malmstrom, who couldn't fly for sour apples, and I failed him. While we were in Japan, Colonel Malmstrom took off in a T-33 in marginal weather conditions and crashed, which was kind of interesting that I had failed him on a check ride just a week before, and but they named the base after him. So it is today Malmstrom Air Force Base, and it's a missile base today. It's not a SAC base, not a SAC fixed wing base. Our mission was in SAC, single plane, single pilot, single target. When I became combat ready in SAC, I was assigned a target in Siberia. And if the whistle had blown, that's where I was going. It turned out that only 28% of the time were the winds such that I could make it back from such a mission. I carefully checked those figures over and over and over again, but that's the way it was. And SAC simply had to assign pilots to those kind of targets, knowing that we didn't have the range unless they could get a tanker out to us. But if they blew the whistle, you know, there was going to be nukes dropped all over the place, and Lord knows where people would go, or whether there'd be any tankers or whatever. But we did mid-air refueling. We went to atomic weapons school to learn how to deal with a nuke on a fighter airplane. We practiced carrying nuke simulators. They looked like the real bomb. We carried them on a centerline pylon on F-84Fs, the swept wing 84s, which were sort of a quasi supersonic airplane. We tossed bombs, low angle bomb release and high angle bomb release. The maneuvers were all new, and a low angle run with a nuclear weapon. The biggest problem is, how does the pilot get away from it? You make a run in about to an IP point about 20 miles from the target, and you do a pull-up about 45 degrees pull-up, and then you with a computer's help, you pickle a bomb off, and it goes in a long arc to the target, whereas you do some kind of a turn, an Immelman or just a hard turn, and get back down on the deck to protect yourself from the explosion when she goes. The other kind of maneuver, that the low angle stuff wasn't real accurate. We tossed bombs all over North Dakota. They developed another run called an over-the-shoulder toss, where you actually fly in over the target at high speed, as high speed as you could carry that weapon at, and do a 4G pull, and actually do first half of a Cuban 8 up over the top and down the other side, And as you came past over the target and then pulled, of course you were beyond the target, and as you curved back upside down, the weapon would release at about 90, I've forgotten the numbers now, 91 degrees or something. You're really throwing the weapon straight up. And the weapon would go way up and then come down. And during that time, you, of course, went over the top and back down on the ground, going away from the target as fast as that thing would travel. And so we practiced those kinds of maneuvers with practice bombs until we could do pretty well. We could get within 100 to 200 feet, and with a nuke, that's good enough. We had some exercises. General Curtis LeMay was head of SAC those times, and he ran exercises. One I remember where that we literally took off, and we didn't know if we were carrying the real thing or not. And they had a system where it was a fail-safe system, so if you didn't get a go at a particular point, you turned around and came back. And I was out over Point Barrow, headed for Russia, and I got the recall to come home. And I didn't know if the simulator, from inside the cockpit, you couldn't tell whether you had a nuke or a simulator under the airplane. And it was interesting experience, and it really made you think, because you just left your wife an hour before. Those were interesting days. Finally, I wanted to go to test pilot school. When we got to Great Falls and started flying the 84F, we lost a number of pilots in transition. That old hog was, it was a kind of a neat airplane, but it'd kill you quick. And we did lose some. I was a flight commander and at one point operations officer. So when we lost a pilot, my wife had to go and talk to the family of the pilot we lost and help them pack up, and that just got to her, and she essentially said, "Look, I can't do this anymore. I'd like us to get out of the Air Force." And I did. In October of 1955, our first son was born at the hospital at Great Falls, the Air Force Hospital, and 2 weeks later I got my discharge, and we went back to Pittsburgh. Coincidentally, that first son, whose name is Dana Purifoy, became an Air Force fighter pilot, an Air Force test pilot, and is now a NASA research test pilot. And he's here at Oshkosh. He flew the NASA active aeroelastic wing F-18 experimental airplane from California here for the fly-in. So he's way ahead of where I was. I actually had orders to test pilot school when my wife and I decided that was not the way we ought to go. But Dana's carrying on.
You had mentioned earlier in your training on the F-84 where you were losing a person a day.
At gunnery school, that's right.
Gunnery school. Was that, in those cases too, you were actually losing aircraft too, right, at basically the same rate?
That's right. A lot of the aircraft that were lost were P-51s. because they were flying gunnery in both 51s.
Direct that to Nick, please.
Yeah, they were flying gunnery both with Mustangs and with the Thunderjets, and a great number, the majority, I think, although I don't have the facts, the majority of the fatalities were foreign students. And they were crazy things. It was easy to, for example, to make a run on a target and fire your rockets. You maybe fire 2 at a time, 1 from each wing, and off they'd go. And you want to see where they hit. And so you watch them. And you could fly right in, right behind them. And that happened a number of times. You could get too low in a high angle bomb run and simply not leave yourself room enough to pull out. You could go too low in a napalm run. And it was easy to do some of those things. I dropped napalm on a tank one time, and you literally were low enough so that you could scrape the napalm off on the tank. You literally could hit the tank with the napalm. Crazy things, and the airplane itself, particularly the 84, for pilots who had never flown it before. We had people go in because of that Mach problem, and there were a lot of ways to get killed, and we did kill a lot.
Anything that we haven't asked you that you'd like to tell us about? Your relationship with EAA?
I joined EAA not too long after I got out of the Air Force in the late 50s. Came to Oshkosh with my family. I have 3 sons, and we came up here and camped every year. I wanted an aerobatic airplane so bad I could taste it. I couldn't afford it. So 2 of us decided that what we'd do is to find ourselves an old Piper Cub and clip it. So we did. We found a Piper Cub in oh dear, at the University of Michigan. And my son Dana was an aeronautical engineering student at the University of Michigan. And we found this airplane, my partner and I, and called Dana up and said, Dane, go down and look at this Cub and see if you think it's worth our coming to get serious about. And he did, and said, yeah, it looked like a nice Cub. Why don't you come? So we went up there and flew it, and liked it, and the price was right. Paid $4,000 for it. Flew it home. Flew it as a standard 65 horse Lycoming J3 Cub for about a year. Put wheel pants on it and gussied it up a little bit, but it was still a long wing Cub. And we decided, well, we'd go to Fond du Lac to the aerobatic competitions down there, and we really wanted a Cub that would do aerobatics. So we decided to clip it. And so we took the wings off and tied it behind my station wagon and towed it home, put it in my garage, and took it all apart. In 17 months, we rebuilt it completely, cut 7 feet off the wings, changed the rib spacing, built new struts for it, built an 85 Continental engine for it, and put it all back together. And there were only the insides of the instruments did we not have our hands on with that airplane. And we had a pretty little clip Cub, which we flew here to Oshkosh a number of times. We'd load the back end with camping gear, and a tent, a small backpacking stove, and up we'd come and camp under the airplane. And I sold my half of the airplane in 1980. before, when I decided I needed to keep a promise that I had made to myself years before, and build a sailboat that I could sail solo across the Atlantic Ocean. The promise was made on one of my last missions way up on the Yalu River. I got hit pretty hard coming off the target. And I promised myself, if I can get the airplane and myself back home, I will treat myself to a solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean in my own sailboat before I'm 60 years old. I got to be 58, and I said, if I'm going to do this, I better get at it. And so I did. And in order to do that, I had to sell my half of the airplane to get some money to build the boat with. And I have been an ocean navigator and a long-distance sailor since that time. I lost my right eye a few years ago. I can't fly anymore. So I get my flying vicariously through my son now. But I sure don't regret any of the flying that I did.
Thank you so much for all you've done for us.
Oh, all I did was tell stories.
Well, maybe with this new sport pilot rule, you won't have to worry about that physical.
I miss flying a lot. Well, I'm 75, and
You might like some of these. Dave's got a hot rod airplane he's building, a Sonics. Check those out.
I'm afraid my wife would have a fit if I did that.
Well, thank you very, very much. Now, wait. I gotta unplug you.
Yep.